Hello and welcome to lecture number 5. Today we're going to talk about the actions and accomplishments of a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. For some, Napoleon was seen as a wonderful conqueror and a great military genius, and that's true, but others saw him as the son of the devil, as these two images show. We'll start with a brief biography and then address some of the accomplishments that Bonaparte put into place as he was the leader of France. We'll look at some successes as well as some of his failures. One thing you want to keep in the back of your mind is an evaluation. You want to be able to evaluate the legacy that he left for the people of France. We'll begin with a bit of biographical information and try to look into Napoleon the man. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769. His family was a member of the minor nobility, however they didn't have a whole lot of money, so that meant that there were limited opportunities for him as a young man growing up. He actually was not born in France. He was born in Corsica. Corsica originally was a colony of Italy, but during his lifetime it became a colony of France. It's circled here on the map. As a boy, Napoleon attended a military academy and he demonstrated a skill in math. This helped him earn a commission as a lieutenant in 1785 of an artillery unit. During the wars of the French Revolution, his career really took off. At the age of 25, he was named a brigadier general as he demonstrated his ability to lead troops. Eventually, he helped gain control of Italy for his country. And then in 1799, he was named to the Directory. Do you remember this slide from a previous lecture? The Directory was the government of France from 1795 to 1799, and it was created as a result of another new constitution. Power was held by 5 individuals. Napoleon initially was one of those individuals who held power. Well, Napoleon took advantage of his popularity as a war hero, and in 1799 he overthrew the Directory and established himself as the sole leader of France. If you're interested in some biographical information about Napoleon, I would encourage you to watch this YouTube video, which is available on Canvas. It's actually really good, and it's only 5 minutes, so it could give you a good preview. You could stop the presentation now, or you can do it a little bit later. Once Napoleon staged this military coup and took over as the leader of France, he established a range of reforms. We'd like to explore some of those next. Before we explore some of Napoleon's specific actions, I did want to define a term first. The term is the plebiscite. Here's a textbook definition. It's a direct vote by the people on a particular issue. Now, this appears to be something that's very democratic, and it enhances the democratic process because it allows the people to give a choice. Yes, I support an action, or no, I'm against it. However, as we will see with Napoleon, often there really isn't much of a choice or an opportunity for people to voice their concerns, and we'll see why here in a second. So a plebiscite allows the people to vote on a particular issue. In 1799, Napoleon overthrew the government. He had the people vote as to whether or not they would approve or reject his actions. In the end, 3 million voted and said, yes, we approve of your actions. Only 3,000 disapproved. That overwhelming vote of support seemed to legitimize Napoleon's actions. But do you remember this slide from a previous lecture? Basically, what Napoleon was asking was, would you rather go back to the guillotine and the imprisonment of thousands, or would you like to have me as the leader of France? It was really a false choice. 5 years later, Napoleon named himself emperor for life. He staged another plebiscite. In this case, 3.5 million people voted to approve his actions, and fewer than 3,000 disapproved. Basically, what Napoleon was doing was he was using the rhetoric of the revolution and of democracy to legitimize what he was doing. But in actuality, people had very little choice whatsoever. This painting depicts the important ceremony where Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. The arrow was pointing to Napoleon himself. I've seen this painting. It's huge, larger than life. Another set of reforms are referred to as the Concordat. These were a series of agreements between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII, who was the Pope in 1801. First of all, Catholicism was named the preferred religion of the people of France. This basically was just stating a fact. Secondly, France reverted back to the old or traditional calendar. Remember this slide from a previous lecture? This identifies the French Revolution's new calendar. 1789 would be the New Year one. There would be several weeks in a year, but each week would be 10 days rather than 7. That new calendar was seen as an attack on Christianity. Again, this is from a previous lecture. Well, under that Concordat, this new calendar was rejected, and they went back to the old calendar. There were some additional provisions as well. The Catholic Church would be allowed to have a great deal of control over primary education, basically education up to about grade 3 or 4. However, there was a catch. Church leaders, priests, as well as bishops and others, had to maintain their loyalty and take loyalty oaths to the new government. Overall, because Catholicism was so popular in France, these steps and the Concordat were very popular in France and helped to enhance Napoleon's popularity. Probably the widest-ranging reform that Napoleon put into place was his famous code. First of all, it established equality under the law. While the Catholic Church might be the preferred religion, there was religious freedom in France, and all privileges based on birth were abolished, just as they had been during the French Revolution. Secondly, individuals were allowed to choose their own occupations based upon their skill levels and interests. However, there were some returns to tradition. The father's absolute authority over his family was restored. This was seen in a couple ways. First of all, fathers had total control over their children's lives until the age of 25. Also, wives owed, quote, their obedience to their husbands. According to some scholars, it might be impossible to overestimate the significance of the Napoleonic Code. While it did not establish full equality throughout all of France, it created opportunity for millions that had not been there in the past. The nobility was crushed. There would no longer be nobles and members of the peasantry. It also helped to reinforce some of the major values that people fought and died for during the French Revolution, based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. One last reform I'd like to look at left a lasting legacy for Napoleon. This dealt with education. First of all, as mentioned before, local churches would be in charge of primary education, but one important factor is that this education was open to both boys and girls. Napoleon also supported the establishment of lyceas. These were high schools. They were designed to provide an educated workforce for people to work as public servants. Napoleon also helped to found the University of France. As you can see, Napoleon was quite a reformer as he established a wide range of reforms that impacted society. However, there were also limits to these reforms. Yes, the Napoleonic Code transformed society. However, people lived in a police state. For example, there was no freedom of the press. By 1811, there were 4 newspapers that were publishing information in the city of Paris. All were controlled by the state. Even people's mail was open and censored. If a person was opposed to Napoleon and his regime, they were crushed. In fact, Napoleon created a secret police in order to investigate and to attack these critics. The head of Napoleon's secret police, Joseph Fouché, is shown here. He was in charge of a huge network of spies who went to restaurants, brothels, any place in public to try to listen to what people were saying. Even theatrical productions were censored. If Napoleon disapproved of a playwright's work, his career was over. Now that we've explored some of the reforms put into place by Napoleon and their limits, I'd like to look at some of his actions as a conqueror. As a military tactician, Napoleon had a clear goal. He wanted to control all of Europe and establish a huge French empire. The capital of this empire was very clear. It would be the city of Paris. He wanted to establish a society based upon the concepts included in the Napoleonic Code. There was only one problem: how to pay for this. Remember this map from an earlier presentation? The French had controlled much of the interior of North America up to 1750, yet they had lost it in the French and Indian War. Well, the green area here shows the area of Louisiana. The French had regained control of Louisiana in the early 1800s. The French sought out a buyer for this territory: the United States. The French eventually sold the entire territory of Louisiana to the United States for $15 million. This gave Napoleon the money that he needed. He also demonstrated his success in other areas. He was a very skilled military leader. Before I look specifically at Napoleon's actions, I did want to identify Napoleon's nemesis. This is the Duke of Wellington. He was once asked, after he defeated Napoleon, who was the greatest general of all time? And he replied, "In this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon." Napoleon established so many military innovations that they're difficult to quantify, but I'll identify a few. First of all, he understood the importance of supply systems, and he even created the supply depot. He understood that an army moves on its stomach, and they needed access to food, ammunition, and all other supplies, and he was legendary with his efficiency. Secondly, he unified infantry, cavalry, along with new technology, artillery. He came from the artillery background, and he used it to destroy his enemies and annihilate them as these were combined for important attacks. He also had a tremendous personal charisma, and often, particularly as a young officer, put his own life into his hands as he led charges on the field of battle, and this was important, and he was a role model for others. By 1810, basically all of Western Europe was under the control of the French, and this map identifies the extent of the French Empire in that era. France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and portions of what are now Germany and Poland were under the direct control of France. Major allies included Austria, Prussia, and Norway. Napoleon also was aided by something else. This was the draft. Napoleon had access to the largest armies in Europe, in part due to conscription or the draft. Each community was required to provide a certain number of soldiers based upon their population. A draft lottery was conducted to see who had to actually serve. Those who were drafted had to serve, or they were allowed to hire a substitute. This demonstrates the total power of Napoleon over people's lives. In honor of Napoleon's victories, the Arc de Triomphe was constructed in the city of Paris, and you see that on the left. On the right, you see a close-up of Napoleon. He's celebrating his victories there. Napoleon tried to demonstrate that he was part of a lineage of great military leaders like the Romans. The Romans had established these arches. Well, he did the same by creating the Arc de Triomphe, or the Arch of Triumph. Not every European nation supported this control that France had over Western Europe, so a coalition was formed in order to fight the French. By 1812, an alliance was formed between several different countries to fight the French. They were led by the British, but it also included Austria, Prussia, and Russia, as well as Spain. The arrows here point to some of the members of this coalition. The British led it. There was a guerrilla war in the country of Spain. Austria and Prussia are shown here, as well as Russia. Napoleon was not one to stand idle. He developed a grand army, one of the largest ever in world history in 1812, to undertake an invasion of Russia. He would have 600,000 troops against about 160,000 Russians. The French attacked in early July. However, the attack was undertaken later than Napoleon had wanted. The Russians continually retreated and established a scorched earth policy as they did not allow the French to live off the land, and the French grew further and further away from their supply lines. The arrows here demonstrate some of the progress in the fight that Napoleon had against the Russians. The French were just waiting for a pitched battle so that they could defeat the Russians once and for all. However, the Russians continued to retreat further and further away as they began to head toward the city of Moscow. This painting depicts the city of Moscow on fire. Russian troops actually set fire to many of the buildings in their own city because they knew that the further the French were away from their supply lines, if they could just hold off until the winter started, the French would be stuck and they would have to retreat. The French did occupy the city of Moscow for about 30 days. However, their supply lines were overextended, and once the winter hit, they were forced to retreat. By the time they returned to France itself, only 100,000 out of the 600,000 troops remained. This was a huge mistake on the part of Napoleon, and it eventually resulted in his downfall. This drawing depicts some French troops as they were trying to retreat back to France. Napoleon and his men had overextended themselves, and they faced ruin. Eventually, that coalition of European nations invaded France and defeated Napoleon and deposed him in 1814. I really like this political cartoon. You could just imagine Napoleon saying, "Take Russia," they said. "What could go wrong?" they said. Well, he ended up defeated. The Kremlin was a fortress originally built during the Middle Ages that occupies the city of Moscow. You can see it from a distance here. It included cathedrals as well as a political center. The Kremlin includes several governmental offices, and Vladimir Putin today occupies one of these offices here. When Napoleon and his troops occupied the city of Moscow and the Kremlin, they began to strip away all of the wealth in the area. And Russians are famous for their icons. In that spot where the arrow is pointing, there originally had been an icon of Jesus, while the French stole it. There are several cathedrals in the Kremlin as well. This is Assumption Cathedral. It's a place where the Czars were crowned. Well, in order to try to insult the Russians, when the French occupied Moscow, Napoleon kept his horses here. It was used as a horse stable. Following the defeat of Napoleon, the Russians built this arch to memorialize their victory over the French forces. This is located at the furthest area that French troops advanced in the city of Moscow in 1812. They had to retreat after they got to that location. Lastly, I'd like to look at the legacy and some things to consider concerning Napoleon. Well, Napoleon's legacy was mixed. In many ways, we can see him as a positive figure because his reforms created opportunity for millions. However, in many ways, he was negative. France was devastated as a result of decades of warfare. Hundreds of thousands of people died. The French economy was in a shambles. Maybe it was a negative impact. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to write an essay that describes Napoleon's impact on society, his evaluates him as a military leader, and overall, do you think his legacy was positive or negative? Well, that's all we have for today. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you found it interesting. Have a good day.